there's a huge myth out there that I feel a need to challenge in this week's blog. I know I've challenged it before in different ways, but this myth keeps coming back up over and over again, and it's deceiving millions of people. What is this myth? Well, simply put, it's that if you follow what the science says, you can't follow Jesus. If you follow the science, you can't believe in Jesus, especially the miraculous things associated with him, in particular, his resurrection, which is the most fantastic miracle of all. If there's one thing we in America, especially after this past year or so, agree on, it's that we should always follow what the science says. We may not have been able to agree on what the science actually said over this past year at times, but we do agree that when the science is clear, we should follow it. In fact, to not follow the science would be intellectual suicide. There's one group of people that still have any kind, if there is one group of people that still have any kind of credibility in America, any authority, it's scientists, the institution of science. Certainly, God knows, pastors don't anymore, religious leaders, and politicians don't, and many of the other institutions that people used to take as being credible, trust their authority, don't have that trust anymore, that credibility anymore. But science still does, scientists still do, they have credibility. So if there's one thing that we believe in, if there's one thing that we can agree on in modern America, it's that we should follow the science. But many people say that if you follow the science, you can't follow Jesus. If you follow the science, that it would be intellectual suicide to believe in Jesus at the same time. It's unscientific to believe in Jesus, especially the miraculous things that are associated with him. But there's a huge fallacy in how that myth is constructed. And it is a myth, even though it's taken as fact. It actually is a huge myth because it's built on a logical fallacy. It all comes crashing down when you recognize the fallacy. What is that fallacy? Well, it's the same fallacy that the people in Jesus' hometown of Nazareth made when he came back for the first time during his public ministry. So when Jesus goes out on his public ministry, he returns to Nazareth at some point. It's recorded in Mark chapter 6. He comes back to Nazareth, to his hometown, and they invite him to speak in the synagogue. So he teaches in the synagogue, and the people are amazed at his teaching. They're spellbound by what he's saying. In fact, they begin to ask, where did he get all this stuff? Where did he get all this incredible wisdom? They admire him for his wisdom. And then they start to ask, where did he get the power to do all these miraculous things we keep hearing about? They had heard about his reputation as a miracle worker, exorcising demons and healing people, restoring sight to the blind and healing lepers and even bringing people back from the dead. They'd heard about all of that, and they wonder, where did he get this power? But then they begin to think, wait a minute, we know this guy. We watched him grow up as a little kid. He was that little snot-nosed kid that used to run around the dirty roads of the streets of Nazareth when he was a child years ago. And then he grew up to be a carpenter, and just an ordinary carpenter. Him, God's anointed. And on top of that, we know his family. We know Mary, his mother. We know his brothers and sisters. In fact, they go on to name his brothers. How could he be God's anointed? How could he be doing all these miraculous things we hear about? And so, without ever examining the evidence, without ever looking into the reports about the people who are witnessing his miracles, which they would have access to. I mean, they could go and find out if they wanted to, because those people were still very much alive. They could even talk to the people who Jesus had healed or claimed healed him and interview them and find out what had happened. They could examine the evidence. Without ever examining the evidence, they conclude he could not be God's anointed. It's impossible for him to have done the miraculous things they keep hearing about him having done. Don't miss the move that they make. A priori, and that's the fallacy, that's the logical fallacy that they made 2,000 years ago, and that is being made today. A priori, before examining the evidence, they conclude that it's impossible for Jesus to be God's anointed. I was listening to a conversation between Bishop Robert Barron and Jordan Peterson about a week and a half ago. I was listening to this the interview, and Bishop Barron, in his conversation with Jordan Peterson, began talking about the resurrection. If you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, he has this huge following on social media. He's a social media sensation. And he's got millions and millions of people who follow him, most of which, the demographic is young adult men in their 20s and 30s, which is really surprising because Jordan Peterson is an older academic. He's an older professor, psychology professor. What's even more surprising, though, isn't just that, but that when he does his stuff on social media, all he does is he talks into a camera, much like this, in a very monotone voice, giving lectures that last for an hour or longer. And yet all these young adults keep tuning in. And what's even more surprising that they're tuning in such great numbers, is that the content of what he's saying isn't really that scintillating. In fact, it's harsh, it's countercultural. He challenges a lot of the cultural taboos, the cultural assumptions. And he tells his audience, including those young adult men, that they need to live lives of greater accountability. They need to live lives of greater responsibility and be more ethical. He challenges them to be better people. Not the kind of message that normally gains a large following in our culture. It's not a cute, funny video. This is somebody talking for an hour or so in a monotone voice, telling people to live better lives, to kind of shape up. The reason Jordan Peterson, one of the main reasons Jordan Peterson has such a following, the reason people find him credible, is because as a psychologist, naturally, he's considered a scientist. They trust him because of his scientific credentials. So during this conversation, the topic of the resurrection comes up, and Jordan Peterson has made it very clear in other settings, other videos, that he greatly admires Jesus for his wisdom, much like the people of Nazareth, much like many intellectuals today who admire Jesus for his wisdom. But then he went on to say that as a scientist, he can't believe in the resurrection. He can't believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. It's unscientific. In fact, he thinks that anybody with any kind of scientific integrity, any scientist with integrity, couldn't believe in the resurrection. It's impossible for you to have scientific integrity and to believe in the resurrection. Really? I've been reading this book by John Polkinghorne, one of the leading theoretical physicists of our day, a true scientific insider, and it's called The Faith of a Physicist. John Polkinghorne, in addition to being a theoretical physicist, is also an Anglican priest, a Christian, a believer. As a scientist, he believes that Jesus is God's anointed, God incarnate. As a scientist, he believes in the resurrection. As a scientist, he doesn't see any contradiction between what he's doing as a theoretical physicist and his faith in Christ. In fact, in this book, he's making the argument that the findings of modern physics, some of the most recent things that modern physics over the past years has unveiled about the world, the way it works, the universe, that the best way to make sense of them, the ultimate sense of them, is through the paradigm of the Christian world view. In other words, the most rational way to understand what science has discovered in his mind is through the lens of the Christian worldview. It makes the most ultimate sense of things, of reality. Polkinghorne isn't alone either. As I mentioned before in previous blogs, I mentioned people like Francis Collins or Ian Hutchinson or John Guillen or Michael Guillen, John Lennox, all leading scientists who are also believers in Christ. They don't think it's unscientific to believe in Jesus. What is unscientific, however, is to a priori, again, logical fallacy, to conclude something before looking at any of the evidence, to a priori conclude that you can't follow what the science says and believe in Jesus. People like Jordan Peterson and other leading scientists of our day, and just the kind of the cultural assumption, is built on this fallacy that says that you can make this conclusion without looking at the evidence. In other words, this isn't based on some kind of open-minded, tough-minded, open evaluation of the evidence. They haven't looked into the evidence at all. Before examining the evidence, without ever examining the evidence, they've made the conclusion that Jesus couldn't have risen from the dead. And that's incredibly unscientific. that violates the most basic principles of science, which is all about this kind of open-ended searching for the truth, examining the evidence and then making rational conclusions on it. People who say that you can't follow what the science says and believe in the resurrection at the same time, that would be intellectual suicide, actually are being unscientific. They haven't examined the evidence for the resurrection. They're making an a priori conclusion before looking at the evidence. So don't be deceived. Don't give in to this huge myth before you examine the evidence for yourself. And when you examine the evidence for yourself, what you'll find, at the very least, is that it isn't unscientific to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, that you can follow what the science says and still believe in the resurrection. In fact, if you're like some of the leading scientists of our day, you might find that by following what the science says, you actually are led to belief in Jesus' resurrection. So what do you think about the science and faith? Is there a fundamental contradiction between the two? Can you follow what the science says and believe in Jesus' resurrection? I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can go to the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website and leave them there. Also, if you have any other questions, comments, or feedback, you can leave those comments on that page as well, the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website. I look forward to hearing from you.